And to map out the challenges for workers' power, we asked the people's historian, who has made an indelible impact on the study of the U.S. and international history, to join us.
Dr. Gerald Horne, who approaches his study of history with a worldview shaped by the pivotal factors of the intersectionality of race and class, shaping the economic, political, and social character of world history. He knows which side he's on. He critiques the lasting reverberations of white supremacy in all that he does, and all its bedfellows, imperialism and colonialism, fascism and racism, which continue to wreak havoc in the United States and abroad to this day, and the belief in and the struggles for the society to be ruled by the working class for the working class. Dr. Horne, I want to put forward to you a rhyme for you to excavate for us from Solidarity Forever. All the world that's owned by idle drones is ours, and ours alone. We have laid the wide foundations, built it skyward, stone by stone. It is ours, not to slave in, but to master and to own, while the union makes us strong. Dr. Horne, is this merely at best rhetoric, a shield against the outrageous slings and arrows of capital to be sung at gatherings, or a battle cry, a spear that the working class and its organizations, the unions and workers' centers, truly wish to make so? And good Labor Day to you, and thank you for agreeing to do what you do so well, which is to educate, agitate, and organize for power to the people.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And second of all, let me paraphrase Charles Dickens, who you may recall suggested that this may not be the best of times for the United States working class, but it's certainly not the worst of times. To grasp the meaning of this latter point, one need look no further than the nation's second largest city, Los Angeles, where the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guild, two of the key unions in Hollywood, have been confronting big capital, Disney, Netflix, Amazon, for months now, with tens of thousands of workers on strike. Close students of capitalism may recall that in 1945, the left-leaning Conference of Studio Unions shut down Hollywood, then were locked out in turn, in a sense subjected to a mass firing in 1946, which, like dominoes falling, led directly to the so-called Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which led to a purge of not just communist labor leaders, but left-leaning labor leaders generally, setting the stage for the erosion of wages and working conditions, which reached a climax 4 decades ago during the administration of President Ronald W. Reagan, a former leader of the Screen Actors Guild, who infamously set labor back on its heels by sacking and purging striking members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO, which then set the stage for what the New York Times reported on a few days ago: near misses on airport runways by accelerating jets filled with hundreds of passengers, a disaster waiting to happen. Similarly, even after the defeat of Hollywood labor post-1946, the fact remains that the 1960s upsurge, spearheaded by the Black Panther Party initiated in Oakland, which, other than selling its newspaper that once had a circulation approaching 200,000 weekly, these militants were supported financially by the likes of the sterling actor Marlon Brando and the talented screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, whose screenplay for Spartacus is a landmark in progressive cinema and consciousness raising. He also served a term in prison because of his erstwhile ties to the U.S. Communist Party. The actor Gene Seberg, also a major financial backer of the anti-war pioneering pro-LGBTQ plus Black Panthers, she was driven to her death because of this political relationship. But today, Fran Drescher, Quite remarkably, the nasal voice leader of the Screen Actors Guild, she of the gravelly New York City accent, can lead her members to the picket line with rip-roaring remarks dripping with the intensity of class struggle. And unlike 1945 and 1946, at least not yet, she has not been accused of being a seditious communist, an apparent weakening of the boss's tool of anti-communism. That is not all. It was just weeks ago that members of Service Employees International Union, Local 721, which represents thousands of workers in the City of Angels, conducted a militant one-day strike to pressure those with whom they are negotiating, as the air was filled with the raucous cry, "On strike, shut it down. LA is a union town." This was the first walkout involving city workers in more than 40 years. In December 2022, UCLA graduate students joined a 5-week UC-wide strike that was the largest of its kind and led to a historic contract. In March 2023, teachers in LA walked off their jobs and shut down the school system for 3 days as teachers joined their blue-collar co-workers who were represented by SEIU Local 99, who were in the midst of protracted negotiations. Unite Here, Local 11, which represents hotel and hospitality workers, has staged rolling walkouts across the Southland since the 4th of July weekend. Kaiser Permanente, healthcare workers, picketed across California within recent weeks. UPS just dodged a strike that was to be led by the Teamsters, which once billed itself as the largest union in the capitalist world. Starbucks baristas continue to organize across the Southland, and do not be surprised at all if the United Auto Workers, historically the bellwether of organized labor beginning in the 1930s, takes tens of thousands of workers on strike within days. Union members are so ubiquitous across LA that the colors of their T-shirts, Unite Here red, SEIU purple, Screen Actors Guild black, form what late Mayor David Dinkins of New York City called in a different context a gorgeous mosaic, and their colors are as prominent as the blue of the former Brooklyn, now LA Dodgers. And as the foregoing litany suggests, there's cross-fertilization between and amongst these unions, with writers and actors joining hotel workers, and, as noted, teachers supporting the SEIU. Actually, this latter unity is credited with forging class solidarity across occupational and union lines, which is a key to victory. The city workers, during their one-day job action, featured non-SEIU union members joining the striking lifeguards and traffic officers and sanitation workers and animal shelter workers and airport custodians and engineers. That is not all. So inspired, the LA County Board of Supervisors, which has jurisdiction over the city and its suburbs, is to consider a proposal mandating that hotel and theme park workers in certain areas employers in certain areas pay a wage of $25 per hour, rising to $30 per hour by 2028 when the Summer Olympics arrive in LA. Of course, hotel moguls benefit from county investments in beaches and parks, attracting tourists who pay a pretty penny to stay in hotel rooms. $25 an hour would be a hefty raise over today's $16.90. And yes, this measure has been pushed by Amusement Area Employee Union B192. Just as unions and the working class generally in New York and New Jersey can learn from Southern California's struggles, the latter has sought to emulate the former by making sure that striking workers receive unemployment compensation, albeit in California, it will be with strengthened statutory language surpassing that of New York and New Jersey. In fact, the New York metropolitan area needs to study carefully the lessons of Southern California and vice versa. In this context, do not ignore what is happening with the National Labor Relations Board, the federal agency that bills itself as a kind of referee of class struggle and outgrowth of the labor battles of the 1930s. the NLRB is on the verge of possibly handing a number of victories to unions, including protecting workers on the job who feel compelled to use profanity in protest, and making it simpler for workers to win union recognition, and making it easier for unions to launch secondary boycotts. I could continue in this vein indefinitely, detailing victories and apparent triumphs, but that would mislead leaders and the rank and file who require accurate intelligence before charging into battle. Thus, there is the very fact that the first Monday in September is Labor Day and not May 1st, which was made in USA, but is not necessarily embraced here today, which makes problematic the continuing necessity for workers to unite across national borders, where May Day is widely circulated. The arrival of this triumph could serve to diffuse the demagogic deployment of his immigration hysteria by the right wing. But our weaknesses soar far beyond marking Labor Day in September and not May. The fact is that the level of union density or rate of membership in the private sector lags tremendously, perhaps in the single digits percentage-wise, with a disproportionate percentage of organized labor centered in the public sector, in the ranks of SEIU or the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. Yet we all know that the power behind the government throne is the lurking menace of big capital, Amazon, Netflix, Disney, which underscores the absolute importance of supporting striking Hollywood workers. Yet there is another weakness of organized labor, rarely commented upon. Just as there are various levels of the peasantry, big peasants and small peasants as they're called, and obviously there is a distinction to be made in the capitalist class between Elon Musk, born in apartheid South Africa, and Bill Gates on the one hand, and the owner of the corner bodega on the other hand. There are also distinctions to be drawn between various sectors of the working class. Even under enslavement, there was a distinction between, say, the masses of the 4 million unpaid workers and those few, like the Samuel L. Jackson enslaved character in Django Unchained. Unfortunately, even the most class conscious of U.S. workers have been slow to grasp that the society in which they struggle is a classic example of settler colonialism, which helps to explain the liquidation of the indigenous population by and large. That is to say, when the 1% in England in the 1580s initially sponsored an invasion of what they called North Carolina, they were joined by Englishmen and women and Europeans generally of various class backgrounds, all bent on expropriating the indigenous for mutual benefits. In other words, class collaboration has been a feature of working class politics in this settler regime from its inception, and it still goes a long way in explaining the continuing curiosity of why Staten Island persists in voting in a manner not altogether dissimilar from the posh and fashionable Upper East Side of Manhattan, though big capital is cited in the latter, not so much in the former. And this is not to mention a particular locus of class struggle, speaking of the unpaid sector of the working class before 1865, known as the enslaved, whose very existence led them inevitably into bitter and protracted class conflict. Of course, their epical triumph in the Haitian Revolution of 1804 was not just a mighty blow on behalf of Africans and the oppressed generally, but was also a spectacular victory for the working class as a whole, worldwide, in that the presence of unpaid workers served as a drag on wages and working conditions of workers generally. It is no accident that post-1865, after the abolition of enslavement in the United States, union organizing received significant impetus as battles unfolded to deliver the 8-hour day. Even today, a major victory for the working class, even as we push for a 32-hour work week, not today's 40-hour work week with no cut in pay. Moreover, the liquidation of investments in the bodies of enslaved Africans post-1865 provides a helpful precedent for nationalizing the vast wealth of the economic royalists today, which is one of the many reasons why there is such a vicious targeting of Black workers, as recent events in Jacksonville and Buffalo tend to suggest. It is well known that Black workers are often quicker than most to join unions and vote most heavily against the right wing, often at rates of 9-1, which too makes us a prime target for the neo-fascist forces. In fact, in order to save the planet from climate disaster, the organized working class may have to seize the means of production from the hands of these economic royalists, for their crazed lust for profit is a major cause of today's climate emergency. Of course, the equivalence of Africans with the unpaid sector of the working class not only generated class struggle, it also served to generate a virulent white supremacy and racism, meaning super profits for the 1%, the capitalist class. This ugly trend continues to persist and, in fact, has taken on ever more malignant forms. For example, again in Southern California, Latino workers heavily of Mexican origin endure labor law violations at 4 times the rate of their Euro-American peers, while foreign-born workers are more than twice as likely to experience wage theft, that is to say, not getting paid at all or shorted. There have been actual cases in Los Angeles of Thai workers imprisoned and forced to work for 16 hours a day for next to nothing, which is not only harmful to them, but harmful to our class as a whole. That suggests that it remains true that an injury to one is an injury to all. Likewise, if we are opposed to wage theft, as we are, we of organized labor should be in the forefront of demanding the repair of one of the more profound wage thefts in human history, the exploitation of unpaid African workers for centuries, leading to the just demand for reparations, the absence of which only encourages the parasites to continue to pursue wage theft. There is a related issue as well. It is no accident that the former slave states led by Texas are the anti-union citadels today, serving as a drag on the entire working class, not least, as the Lone Star State has demonstrated, by being in the vanguard of seeking to wreck the bodily autonomy of women, especially women workers. Houston, from where I am now speaking, a metropolitan area reaching 8 million shortly, only has about 123,000 union members. The most unionized major city is Buffalo, where almost 24% of workers are in unions, and not coincidentally, that is where the efforts to unionize Starbucks took flight. In other words, union density tends to spur union drives in a virtuous circle that has long been recognized. After all, as the last great Hollywood strike was proceeding almost 80 years ago, Operation Dixie was launched in order to unionize the South. But alas, it too was wrecked by the deft deployment of anti-communism, the poison of the working class. A top priority for unions today should not only be organizing, but organizing in the Deep South more particularly. Speaking of Thai workers should remind us of the absolute obligation of the U.S. working class to pursue internationalism relentlessly. Again, there has been a checkered record by organized labor in this sphere. I well remember, while residing in New York City before the liberation of apartheid South Africa in 1994, that we had the full-throated participation of some unions, certainly not all. Assuredly, the AFL-CIO, organized labor, intermittently dropped the ball during the Cold War by pursuing the siren song of anti-communism, serving to destabilize organized labor in the hemisphere, particularly allowing bosses to move facilities to low-wage havens, then pacified, contrary to the interests of the U.S. working class. Today, it is possible that the new Cold War against China will have contradictory impact on the working class. Assuredly, it will mean a rise in military spending, taking food from the mouth of babes, while jeopardizing international peace and security. Besides, the Pentagon is one of the major burners of fossil fuels, jeopardizing the planet and human existence particularly. Yet, it is possible that the new Cold War with China will mean, quote, reshoring, unquote. This new term indicating building more facilities on these shores, such as the microchip facility now being built in now being built in Arizona, in order to do an end run around similar facilities in Taiwan, the 23 million strong island off the coast of southern China, which Beijing claims as its own and is today a flashpoint in relationships with Washington. In fact, the new Cold War with China might lead to U.S. giants operating there, including Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, KFC, Starbucks, etc., having to take a haircut. That is to say, being forced to abandon this populous Asian nation and their gigantic market and return to North America, which will provide, admittedly, a tricky strategic challenge for the U.S. working class. Ultimately, speaking of China, organized labor in the United States needs to embark on the long march to political independence, not least because what is won on the picket line can be lost at the ballot box. At one point, it was commonly said in this country, not least in the 1930s, that, quote, every strike is a dress rehearsal for revolution, unquote, meaning preparing our troops for the final conflict, mobilizing and organizing was a prelude to the ultimate goal, seizing political power. So far, and too often, strikes under imperialism have been crushed, leading to counter-revolution. Barring counter-revolution, barring a surge by the well-organized neo-fascist forces, should be a prime priority for organized labor on Labor Day 2023. Thank you.
Professor Gerald Horne, as I think about the observance of Labor Day, which many people may not realize actually came about in many ways as a very deliberate distraction from the far more militant activity of the organized labor sectors of May Day. And so this had become an opportunity for the capitalist class to damp down the sentiments and ultimately distract and turn Labor Day into white sheet sales. No puns, well, maybe a little bit of a pun intended here and there, given the temper of the times. But Dr. Gerald Horne has put the movement back, and the labor movement has put labor back into the Labor Day process so that it is more than an opportunity to buy sheets and towels and the like. But what I am so struck by is what you do and the challenge before us to educate, agitate, and organize, and that is to take the working class beyond the issue of reforms, which are strategic and imperative, and we have an absolute necessity to get people better wages, to get people better working conditions, to get people a voice in the production process, whatever their jobs are. But if one believes in, as I do, and clearly as Dr. Horne, as Ken does, as building bridges, that what we have to begin to look at is the assumption of power by the working class and government by the people and for the people, truly and really, and the people of the working class. What I want to tell people is that aside from this phenomenal essay that Dr. Horne just delivered to us, Dr. Horne has a new book out. I dare say, and I'm not being flippant, that is the name of one of his new books out that is available to us to help do what we need to if we're going to take the working class forward to another stage from wages and benefits to the issue of state control. And to do that, you can have an opportunity to get, I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader, which provides illuminating insights that better informs where we may be headed and outlines what needs to be done to stem the tide of growing fascism across the Western world. Am I exaggerating in terms of the imperative, Dr. Horne, for us to understand that, and that it is certainly one of the prominent features of your new book, I dare say, and for people who are advocates of organizing at the means of production and the assumption of power of the working class, that we really need to study those periods of capitalist development and also from capitalist to growing fascist development?
Well, assuredly, those who are concerned about this evolving climate emergency, as punctuated by the fires in Maui, Hawaii, the present disaster unfolding in the sands of Nevada, the hurricanes in Florida, you should take what we say seriously about the fact that the present economic system, with its insatiable lust for profit, is driving this emergency, is driving this crisis, because it tends to forestall the ability to plan this economy intelligently and certainly reorient it away from senseless consumerism. With regard to your other point, if we should be concerned about the rise of neo-fascism, well, certainly we must be concerned. One need look no further than what's going on in Europe, where you see in Rome today a neo-fascist Prime Minister Meloni is in power, and I'm afraid to say just a few weeks ago was photographed in the Oval Office holding the hand of U.S. President Joseph R. Biden. Or look no further in this other seedbed of 1930s fascism, speaking of Germany, where the so-called Alternative for Germany is growing by leaps and bounds, is basically predicted that it will do quite well in forthcoming elections. And we who were able to witness an attempted coup d'etat on January 6, 2021, should not be naive that those malignant trends will not cross the Atlantic. The seeds are already planted here. And that's why I, too, encourage support for WBAI and Pacifica Radio in particular, because this station and this network has been a steady bulwark against neo-fascism for decades. And if this station is to continue pursuing that noble course, it will require the kind of financial support that our alert and progressive and radical audience should be able to supply.
Well, I do want to tell you, and I know Ken wants to weigh in with some thoughts and questions about this tremendously important new book, one of two new books. There are more in the offing, but there are two that are being made available to us that have not even hit the Google line yet, in essence. They are being made available to you to educate and agitate and organize ourselves for the work that we do to become far better activists, to provide much more theoretical base in order to strengthen our foundation and to build on a foundation theoretically for the activism that we do for state power, because another world is possible if we work really hard and if we have the tools, like books like I Dare Say, to make it so. So I want to mention that Dr. Horne was kind enough to pledge to us at this time 10 books I Dare Say, which you can get by calling 212-209-2950, 209-2950, and I promise that we will also get them autographed for you by Dr. Horne, and you can get those books and continue your theoretical informational process and knowledge and education to be a far better organizer. And I want to ask you, Dr. Horne, within that, or perhaps Ken wants to weigh in on this, where I dare say the kind of essays that it has in, such as you were just discussing some points, that have everything to do with educating the working class to think of itself as assuming the leadership over the state and not really just being the pawns of production or the cannon fodder for industry.
Well, I'll defer to Ken, and then I'll weigh in.
I think we have to have a symbiosis here between what you've been saying in terms of media and the kind of rhetoric and the kind of analysis that you have, and this, what we do at WBAI, which is sometimes not as eloquent as you, but hits on a lot of the same points in this book, other books, and other media that you've been through. And to support both you and us and this, which we don't see in the mainstream media at all, except sometimes in a very critical light. People should go to their phones right now and dial 212-209-2950, 212-209-2950, because it'll support your reading and analysis, which we'll get from Gerald Horne's books, that you'll get to hear Gerald Horne over WBAI again, we hope. And you'll be supporting WBAI, which is the only broadcast outlet in this area, TV or radio, that dares to struggle, dares to win, not only for political power, but for democracy in the labor movement.
And we do want to say that when you call 212-209-2950, the workers, the operators are waiting to take your call. We're asking for a $100 pledge for the books that have, and we have 10 of these books that are available to you. And the name is I Dare Say. That's all you have to say. I Dare Say. So, Dr. Horne, as people pledge to support the station, and as Ken was saying, you and raise the issues of union democracy and so on, where does the issues that are encompassed in I Dare Say fit in to this Labor Day and building the working class movement? I dare say.
It has everything to do with building the working class movement. For example, in this book, or a series of essays that I've written over the years. And a few of the essays deal with foreign policy, which, as I suggested in my opening remarks, has to be a central concern of organized labor. For example, I wrote an essay before September 11, 2001, pointing out the relationship between U.S. imperialism and the religious zealots who were then in power in Afghanistan. This is before the attack on New York and Washington on September 11, 2001, which, as you know, led to the deaths of thousands of individuals, many of whom were workers. Likewise, I have an essay on the Cold War and its damaging and detrimental impact on Black workers in particular, and African workers more generally, not least because the Cold War had a complement, which was the Red Scare, which led to a destabilization of class-conscious union leaders, working class leaders, which then left these communities somewhat isolated and ever more marginalized. Likewise, there is an essay on the Watts Revolt in Los Angeles of August 1965, when, in a spate of gunfire from the police and National Guard, almost 36 young men and women, mostly working class, were gunned down in the streets with no necessary punishment for those who pulled the trigger, which obviously helps us to understand better the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the continuing police terror that our communities are forced to endure. Similarly, there is an essay on a woman of intellectual heft, a working writer by the name of Shirley Graham, subsequently taking the name of Shirley Graham Du Bois. I recommend not only the biography that I wrote about her, but if you want a digest of that, well, then pick up the phone and make a pledge to WBAI and pick up a copy of I Dare Say, and you will receive a summary and outline and sketch of the marvelous and wonderful working class life of one Shirley Graham Du Bois.
We have the working class in this country, and I think it's across the board, whether it's craft or professional unions, whether it's private unions or public sector workers. There's a parochial nature to the work we do, and I know that in my own union, which was it is the UAW. Granted that I am in the professional sector, if you will, the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, which many people may not understand is part of the UAW. But we are constantly told when we raise political issues to advance amongst the membership that it is a distraction. It is a distraction, that unions are there solely for economist purposes, that they are there to look at grievances, which surely they are. They are there to look at a better contract offers, surely they are. The Association of Legal Aid Attorneys has specifically been without a contract for over a year now, and does not have parity with the public prosecutors. And so on, which is a very sore point for very good reason, among other things. So what I'm interested in is really how does I Dare Say, which everybody's going to get. And I think what you do when you get a copy for $100 and it's worth endless amounts, the wisdom, the intellect, the excavation that Dr. Horne has done for decades in ferreting out working class history that understands the imperative of melding, of merging, that there's no distinction between race and class, that they must be looked at, the intersectionality for sure, or you will never be able to set up an egalitarian movement to accomplish a democracy of economic, political, and social equity. So I want to know, in your thoughts about I Dare Say, which people are beginning to call already, 212-209-2950. That number is 212-209-2950. $100 contribution. Just ask for I Dare Say. What do we do with these books? What do you think they do to begin to educate a working class? And is indeed our working class too colloquial, too cloistered, too economist in nature to really begin to think about or assume state power?
Well, as I recall, the late, great West African leader Kwame Nkrumah once suggested that action without thought and education is fundamentally bankrupt and nihilistic. And I tend to agree with that. For us, we, the working class, when charging into battle, we need to be armed with knowledge. And in that light, I should point out to those union members or others who have suggested that your union should focus wholly and exclusively on wages and working conditions. As I said in my opening remarks, what you win on the picket line or at the bargaining table can be lost at the ballot box, which means we also have to be involved in day-to-day political struggles, particularly with regard to influencing our elected representatives and or replacing them if they don't toe the line. Listeners should also know that what animates every word, and I dare say, is my own working class background, coming from a family of Teamsters and packing house workers in the industrial Midwest, St. Louis, Missouri, having worked as a teacher for decades, having served as an officer in a teacher's local, having written books about the National Maritime Union, the sailors and seafarers, having written books, as my opening remarks suggested, about Hollywood unions. The book is entitled Class Struggle in Hollywood, 1930 to 1950, by the way. And interestingly enough, you may also know that I wrote a book about the Caribbean Labor Congress. I only bring that up because of late, the 45th U.S. president has not gotten the memo about the bankruptcy of anti-communism, and he has been red baiting the Judge Chutkan, in his D.C. case, where he is charged with trying to execute a coup d'etat, because she descends from a Jamaican family of the left. And as I was reading articles about his red baiting, I was wondering if Mr. Trump or one of his researchers had consulted my book about the Caribbean Labor Congress. So in any case, I think that those who find themselves in the working class can do a marvelous job, can execute a marvelous task for themselves and for their class by picking up the phone and making us pledge to WBAI or making a secure pledge online at, I believe, WBAI.org.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All that Dr. Horne has given over all these years to WBAI, to the Pacifica stations, because we are just about the only game in town. WBAI has been here for 63 years, a legacy station that has never faltered in uplifting, supporting, at its most difficult times, the issues of working people, of the downtrodden, of the oppressed, and who understands in a program like Building Bridges that Ken and I have been doing for decades, that when we talk about the working class, we talk about the full panoply of issues that encompasses we as human beings and as workers. That means that we look at the issues of, and believe that the working class movements must, the issues of housing, the issues of the right to health care, that we look at the issues of race and all forms of oppression that exist against people. These are fundamental, and they're fundamental issues for unions to take up, for the organizations of the working class to take up. And when we do that, whether we form a party or whether we act in coalition to build movement, up you mighty people, up the working class, we can accomplish what we will. And I must say that in order to do that, we must be much more intellectually grounded in the true history of this country, which has been suppressed. I mean, Gerald's book, Dr. Horne's book, I dare say, and I just want you to give us a little bit of a taste of that, also takes on a very personal note. His own background is that of the working class, and his own political sensitivities was informed by the organization of the working class. And how did that happen? And what was the personal reality for you, to give our listeners a sense of why you bring so much passion along with intellectual heft to your historic excavation?
Well, I come from a long line of enslaved Africans from that heart of darkness known as Mississippi. Growing up in St. Louis, I was regaled with tales about the horrors of Jim Crow Mississippi, how Black people had to get off the sidewalk and walk in the gutter if a non-Black person was walking towards them. My mother grew up in Starkville, Mississippi, the home of Mississippi State University. And when the football team won or when the football team lost, students and other supporters would drive through her neighborhood shooting into their homes. And that was what I was growing up with, those sorts of stories. And then moving to St. Louis, a Jim Crow town, that is to say my parents, to face the difficulty of finding work and employment. I faced the difficulty of being ousted, in fact, our whole family being ousted as a result of urban renewal or Negro removal from the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood of St. Louis, and then taking the paltry sum that was tossed at our feet and moving to another neighborhood of St. Louis, where then we were then subjected to racist assault. So when you grow up with that kind of upbringing, it seems that it may be inevitable that you will be converted into a lifelong working class militant. And one footnote I would add is that I do recall distinctly as a young boy, I won't mention the year, having my mother tell me about the tragedy of the Rosenberg family. You may recall that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were the so-called atomic spies, Jewish American communists who were executed supposedly because they had leaked the purported secret of the bomb to Moscow. But what my mother stressed in telling us the story was the fact that they left behind two young boys. And as a young boy myself, like many young boys, many young children, I was terrified with the idea that someone would remove my protectors, my parents. And so that story of the Rosenbergs stuck with me all of these years. And of course, I've written at length about the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg subsequently. Well, first of all, thank you once more for according me the honor of speaking to your audience on Labor Day. Secondly, I would like to reiterate the final point that I made in my opening remarks, which is that this country, and particularly this U.S. working class, faces a tricky strategic challenge coming soon. It is here now, which is with this new Cold War with China and with the impending U.S. pressure on U.S. corporations to reshore, to evacuate across the Pacific to this country, what will be the positions of the AFL-CIO International Department? What will be the position of our unions? Will they immediately launch an organizing drive, for example, for this microchip plant of strategic importance being built in Arizona, as I mentioned? We can gain knowledge. We can gain foresight, I dare say, by picking up a copy of, I dare say, by making a secure pledge to this radio station and investing in your future, investing in our common future by sending a check or making a charge on a piece of plastic for WBAI Pacifica Radio, New York City.
Dr. Horne, you've been listening. I wish you were able to interact more directly with these pieces, which we specifically recorded. We wanted some real actualities to inform listeners as to the current struggles, the most essential ones of the working class. Your thoughts?
Well, it was quite informative, quite enlightening, quite stirring. I'm moved by the militancy of the unions. And what it reminds me of is that in labor negotiations, as you know more than most, particularly in the private sector, the corporatos, the 1%, they demand total oversight over the direction of the business. And oftentimes unions are in a disadvantageous position to challenge that. But if you look at Hollywood, if you look at Disney, for example, whose stock has been going southward, not least because of poor management, not least because of an overinvestment in what is called linear TV, that is to say, cable in particular, ABC, ESPN, amongst others, while folks are cutting the cord and particularly turning to YouTube to be informed. And so when the unions who toil for Disney accede to the demand by management that management has 100% control over the direction of the business, in a sense, they're putting their fate and the destiny of themselves in the hands of poor business people who are wrecking the business that supposedly is going to supply a livelihood to the workers. I should also say that Barry Diller, a card-carrying member of the 1%, a former studio head, has told the unions that there's nothing to worry about with regard to AI. Move along, folks. There's nothing to see here. But I was pleased to see that the speakers at this rally were not listening to Barry Diller, because we already know that AI, which, by the way, its creators say has the capacity ultimately to destroy human existence, also has the capacity to destroy the livelihoods of writers and actors alike. And I should also say that we should not see it as trivial that one of the few labor leaders who has served in the White House was one Ronald Wilson Reagan, a former leader precisely of the Screen Actors Guild. And I think that that bespeaks the importance of this particular union, which sadly, I'm afraid to say, many of our friends on the left see as an industry comprised of froth. But the fact that Reagan was catapulted from his union position to the governor's mansion in Sacramento, California, and then into the White House shows the strategic importance of Hollywood and the strategic importance of entertainment unions more generally.
Gerald, coming off of this strike, coming off the emergence of more radicalism and activity in the labor movement by the workers, tell us about your books and what your most recent book,
which we're calling Radical Histories.
Radical Histories, and in what way that impacts some of the same issues that we're dealing with here.
And of course, when people get the book, they'll learn even more about it. That's the whole point. Educate, agitate, and organize. Right, Gerald?
Absolutely. And these two books, I dare say, and Radical Histories, to use your shorthand, first of all, these are books that I worked on with younger scholars because, like yourselves, I recognize that I've seen more yesterdays than I'll see tomorrows. So it's well past time to start pushing forward the younger generation and give them a time in the spotlight so that they will be well prepared to advance our struggle well into the 21st century. With regard to this second book, Radical Histories, it deals, amongst other issues, with the unionizing of musicians. You know that a central branch of the American Federation of Musicians, speaking of Local 801, is headquartered precisely in New York City. We know that disproportionately talented musicians are cited in New York City. I talk in this book we're referring to as Radical Histories about the organizing of musicians to fight back against horrible working conditions. For the longest time, jazz musicians in particular had to ply their trade in smoky clubs, and of course, that led to secondhand smoking and the possibility of lung cancer, not to mention dealing with barracudas, who often engaged in notorious wage theft, shorting them, forcing them to sign adhesion contracts and all the rest. And so when I hear the leaders and the activists of SAG-AFTRA complain about their working conditions, it resonates with what I talk about, and I underline talk about, because this is a book of conversations about history, more so than documented narratives, which is what I've traditionally specialized in. This book also has details about my own labor history, particularly in New York, Mimi and Ken, because you know that while I was in New York, at least for a while, I worked side by side with the leaders of the hospital workers union, one of the more progressive and militant unions in the country. Dr. King called it his favorite union. And I'm proud to have been associated with that union. And certainly, if there are any union members within range of my voice, they should make a pledge immediately, if not sooner, because you'll see your history represented in this latest book. And of course, I talk about the general strike of 1934 by West Coast stevedores, headquartered in San Francisco. That helped to set this tone for a rise of radicalism in California and generally. There's a straight line that one can draw from the general strike of 1934 of stevedores to the unrest engineered by Hollywood labor in the 1940s up until this very day.
Gerald, there is in the second book that we're dealing of, and you can get them both as a package if you want, for goodness sakes, make a $200 contribution. But we're splitting it right now and making it easier for some who may be able to say, well, this one is one I've got to have. I need these conversations because it's accessible. There's a humanity, and you begin to get to know Gerald Horne in a very personal and important way. And with that, I want to ask him about this particular book that we will also get you an autographed copy of, and we're calling it just a short of hand. Don't mean to usurp the name in any way, but we're calling it Radical Histories. And you can call 212-209-2950. You said that it is, and it is. It's an instructor. It's a roadmap. It's a path forward. Not a roadmap in the sense of this is what you must do. There's nothing dogmatic. There's nothing rhetorical. It's about the compiled wisdom of somebody. But how is it that you feel, when many people have become cynical, that the issue of organized labor and the issue of organizing at the seat of production still has such momentum and such value? And we don't mean just in a factory setting, because frankly our universities and so on are the equivalent. They're just they are have an industrial character to them, albeit with a different kind of professional white-collar edge to it. But talk about how important it is to really understand organizing within one's workplace, and what are some of the lessons that you draw on in this book, which we're calling Radical Histories, which you can get for your $100 contribution. And oh, by the way, because of our wonderful match funds, it'll be worth double, and it's priceless to you for all the information it contains. Dr. Horne?
Well, I was pleased to hear that interview you did with the journalist who studies the United Auto Workers, because that particular union has played an enormous role, not only in terms of the working class, in terms of unions and the battle for higher wages and working conditions, but even under the leadership of Walter Reuther, who I understand why your interviewee criticized his administration. But the fact is that the anti-Jim Crow movement, what is popularly referred to as the Civil Rights Movement, could not have gained altitude but for the assistance of the United Auto Workers. To this very day, a major fundraiser for the NAACP takes place in the headquarters of the United Auto Workers, speaking of Detroit, Michigan. And that's not coincidental, not only because the UAW to this very day has a complement of Black workers who were desperately concerned about the fate and destiny of the anti-Jim Crow movement, but also because even with Walter Reuther, there was a recognition that the working class as a whole could not progress as long as a significant component of that class, speaking of Black workers, were anchored in the mire of Jim Crow. Likewise, you know that we have been students of the anti-apartheid movement, which led to the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994, and still we see that South Africa is struggling under very difficult conditions. But we also recognize that that victory would not have been possible but for the assistance of labor around the world, but more specifically, the struggles of mine workers, in particular in South Africa, particularly gold miners at the point of production. And so I'm not sure who these folks are who dismiss the importance of labor struggles, of union struggles, of organizing in the workplace, of organizing at the point of production. But if there are a few of those folks in your audience, they should be the first. They should be first in line to pick up the phone and dial 212-209-2950 and make a pledge to get these books and perhaps continue to support building bridges.
Well, thank you for that. And I must punctuate our discussion with you by saying that everything that you do, and I think, again, Danny Glover said it so pointedly, so well, there is the refusal to do what our society does, which is separate, and which much of the left does. It separates the issues of race and class. It separates the issues of class and xenophobia and other forms of bias, as though you just ameliorate the economic woes and therefore all the other components of white supremacy are dissipated and the disparate treatment just disappears. You bring it all together. How important is that for us to learn and understand and represent it in your book, in each and every one of these essays of radical histories, so that we can really create the movements within the labor community sphere brought together, create the movement, bring the movement back to the labor movement by bringing that unity of understanding that we cannot have a better society, we cannot have an economically just, politically just society without a society that is egalitarian in nature and eliminates and structures that elimination of bias, private and state policy into being.
Well, first of all, with regard to your prior point regarding race and class, as I tried to suggest in my opening remarks, and for those who may have not been present some moments ago when I gave that opening essay, one of the points I was trying to stress and illuminate is that in the United States, what's referred to as, quote, race, unquote, oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes is a concealed class question, because we're talking fundamentally about a class of workers who were brought to these shores against their will to work for free. And that is fundamentally a class question, which leads to class struggle, a ethic and ethos, which has then been bequeathed to the descendants of the enslaved Africans, such as myself, as we continue to vote against the right wing 9-1. And in this context, let me also return to the second book, which we're calling Radical History. There is quite a bit in that book about a union that I spent quite a bit of time writing about. I'm speaking of the National Maritime Union, at one time one of the most powerful and potent unions in this country, insofar as they had a stranglehold over exports and to a degree imports as well, working hand in glove with other waterfront workers such as the stevedores, most notably on the West Coast. Recall my reference a few moments ago to the general strike of 1934 in San Francisco, spearheaded by these longshore workers. But alas, they ran aground on the shoals of anti-communism. It helped to destabilize the union to the point now where that once mighty union, the NMU, is not as mighty as it once was. And in fact, oftentimes sailors, even on U.S. flagships, not to mention flagships that carry the emblem of Liberia, for example, or other flags of convenience, are oftentimes working under disastrous conditions. Oftentimes they're working in what are referred to as floating slums. And that is a case study of how regressive politics can run a union aground, leading to the destruction of their standard of living and plunging folks who work for a living to the level of being poverty-stricken. So once again, for those in your audience who still may have doubts about the importance of having a strong union, who still may have doubts about the importance of organizing in the workplace, you need look no further than this book that's being offered as a premium for building bridges for a mere $100. And if you pick up the phone and dial 212-209-2950, that particular lesson can be yours to study.
And that's Radical Histories. That's what we're calling it for your ease. Because Dr. Gerald Horne, a longtime activist and anti-racist and working class struggles, whose writing plays such an important role in bringing to the fore important dimensions of struggles for freedom along the intersections of race and class. This is a must-have, and how gracious you are with your time, how knowledgeable you are, and to share that with us is just an absolute pleasure. It's enlightening, it's exciting, and if you folks want to get some more of the wisdom of Dr. Gerald Horne, do call 212-209-2950, 212-209-2950, $100 for Radical Histories, or you can do $200 for Radical Histories, and I dare say, I don't mind if you do both, and know that because of our wonderful matching grant, because of this program, your money will be worth double. So thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for all that you do, will continue to do.
You're marvelous, you really are.
Even though you say that you're going to be paving the way for those who come next, great, but you still got many very happy unbirthday, as they say in Alice in Wonderland's Through the Looking Glass, to be celebrated by us in all that you do for lifting up the working class and for, well, workers of the world to unite, because you've got nothing to lose but your chains.
And a world to win.
Well, you've said that so matter-of-factly. I agree. I'm Mimi Rosenberg.
I'm Ken Nash.
And we have been building bridges to you this Labor Day, and with the pivotal role of the great, great historian, actually a national treasure, Dr. Gerald Horne. Thank you for listening. Dr. Horne, thank you for your commitment to equal rights and justice.